Hello, friends, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Raymond Nicolet Trust Podcast. My name is Gavrilo Nikolic, and every month I bring you inspiring conversations about the future of education, science, and philanthropy from world top academics, scientists, Nobel Prize winners, and philanthropists. My guest today is Dr. Bojan Aleksov. Bojan is the Associate Professor at the UCL School of Slavonic and Eastern European Studies in London. His principal research interest lies in what he believes to be the key issue in the modern history of the Balkans, namely the nexus of religion and nationalism, the two most powerful identitarian forces. Next to nationalism and religion, Bojan is interested in local resistance movement during the Second World War and the activities of faith-based charities in the Balkans and investor support to churches and religious organizations in the hope that they will contribute to reconciliation and stabilisation in the region of former Yugoslavia. If you're curious to learn more about Bojan and his academic career, including research interest, you need to listen to this episode. In just a moment, the one and only Dr. Bojan Aleksov. Professor, welcome to the RNT podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Let us start with basics. Where are you currently and what are you doing as we speak?
I just finished consultations with students and I'm in my office in central London, in Bloomsbury. Yes.
I need to underline as well before we continue that we are recording this just ahead of the weekend. So I think it's a nice way to wrap up the week.
Thank you.
So before we go on with our conversation and come back to your principal research interest, can we start with some basics and ask you, when did you originally take interest in history?
I didn't expect this question. I was interested more in theater and drama, and I tried unsuccessfly to study theater in Belgrade, where I'm from. And as I failed, I had to enroll and study something. And my father used to say that I chose to study at Belgrade Filozofski Fakultet, or the department philosophy, where also history is based, because of its prestigious location, being surrounded by the best bars and drinking venues in Belgrade. So it was rather a random, let's say, decision. And then as I began studying, I became interested. So it wasn't an interest, let's say, childhood interest. And then my interest deepened as I went to postgraduate studies in Budapest, where I had the opportunity to meet and to be taught by some of the greatest historians of our age, and who then pushed me into this direction, and then I really embraced history and became historian.
Why did you decide to focus on the history of modern Balkans, or modern history of Balkans, if I can call it that way? What motivated you to take this step?
Well, I was studying in 1990s in Serbia, which was a very dramatic and tragic time, and that interest to understand what was happening around me and on the streets of Belgrade, and I was very active also on what was happening on the streets. So this was how I became deeply, let's say, involved both in what was happening, but also trying to understand and why was there, as Bismarck used to say, too much history in the Balkans, or too much for Balkans to swallow it or to digest it, in a free interpretation of his words.
Professor, could you please expand a bit on your major research interests that I have already mentioned in the introduction? Why did you decide to focus on these specifically?
So while I was still in Belgrade and I was an anti-war activist and I was also opposing military conscription and dealing with this issue of conscientious objection, I came across first one man and then several men in Serbia who belonged to a little known religious sect called the Nazarene, mostly several thousand still living in Vojvodina, who are only known by the fact that Nazarene men refuse conscription, refuse to wear weapons and participate in war. Okay, and they take literally commandments from the Bible, and I was very impressed by this attitude and this dedication that cost many of them their lives. Some or many would spend up to 12 years in jail for these strongly held Christian anti-militarist beliefs. And then I wanted to explore further this religious group or movement, how it appeared, and it appeared in the second half of the 19th century in the Habsburg monarchy, and it appeared and spread the most among Orthodox Serbs in what was then Karlovci Metropolitanate. And I found that this rather interesting, although there were members of other ethnic groups, Hungarians, Germans, Slovaks. There were barely any converts, let's say, among Catholic Croats or some other groups. And so I realized that there was a huge gap in our historiography, official or confessional, as we term it, historiography of the Serbian church in the 19th century. And I discovered that there was a lot of discontent with the church and a lot of soul searching, and that was the reason that thousands or tens of thousands converted to this new religion or and joined this new church, and I then dedicated my postgraduate research into analyzing the causes of the appearance and spread, and also the consequences of this spread of the Nazarenes, which then spread into Serbia proper, south of Sava and Danube River, and had a major influence in the emergence of the so-called Bogomolci movement, and then through the activities of Bishop Nikolai Velomirovic, Bogomolci movement was supposed to get rid of their Nazarene or neo-Protestant influence and become Orthodox or official, and this was a long process with lots of conflicts throughout the interwar period, and then thanks to the activities of Bishop Velimirovic and some others, they have managed to bring back into fold, let's say, most of these of Bogomolci, and later many of them became monks and nuns and have kept Serbian church alive during the period of repression post Second World War. Okay, so while doing this research, I realized how important were these issues of confessional belonging and their relations to the other identity issues, namely ethnic or once nation state was created, national belonging, and the interplay of these two, and that's then became the topic of many of my research works.
Can you please develop a bit more about the main research conclusions of your work, specifically on the issue of how religion sparked the nationalism in the Balkans? I believe that is quite interesting for a majority of our audience listening to this today.
Well, the issue of the interplay between confessional and ethnic identities for many hard to grasp, because there is this understanding or belief that they are always combined, that the religious or confessional and ethnic identity are somehow made, cemented, or meant to be together, which is not necessarily the case. There are cases in Europe, let's say in Holland or in Hungary, where this is not the case, or even in the Balkans among Albanians who are split among at least three or more confessions. Okay, but it is the case in many other examples, especially when the foreign threat, like in Irish or in Polish cases, the threat of foreign Protestant, English Protestants in Irish case, fortified these Irish Catholic nationalism, and in Polish case also the threat of foreign Russian Empire, Orthodox Empire, fortified the Catholic, Polish Catholic nationalism. And in the Balkans, it seems that, except the case of Albanians that I just mentioned, that in almost every case there is a strong correlation of these two identities. However, in my various works, I have demonstrated that this was not always like this, and that this is the process and the result of historical processes and developments, and that there is a lot of causality of factors and agencies, personal actions of a few people who have made it happen, and that it is in fact a rather recent development in the Serbian case, or also for the most part in the Croatian case. This identification happened in the interwar period, so very recent, less than a century old. And as we know, in 19th century it was possible that Dalmatian Catholics identify with Serbs in Serbia, and especially among Bosnian Muslims, it was very common to accept both Serbian or Croatian affiliation and identity, which then over the course of the 20th century has changed, and the Bosniak nation building, which took place again under the threat of war in 1990s, then developed the same mechanisms and the same correlation, copying basically the Serbian and Croatian nationalism, and developing this nationalism with strong religious, in the case of Bosniaks, Islamic confessional component. So, and then there are obviously influences from those who did this first, and there is agency, and I have looked at some of also the famous um, minds and personalities such as Dositej Obradović and his legacy. I have looked at one of the greatest poets of 19th century, Jovan Jovanović Zmaj, how they had different attitudes and different understanding to this issue, just to show the historicity, how this is a process which happened in particular historical period as a result of particular very concrete and easily identifiable historical factors and agency.
Professor, you did a lot of research on this topic and in this area. What are some of the remedies policymakers could undertake? I intentionally said could because that depends on their will, of course, to reduce the constant political tensions. What are some of the recommendations of your research, if you could share?
This is a difficult question because knowledge or academic knowledge and academic research is not easily translatable into policy sphere, and our knowledge and our research constantly evolves. It's a debate where we criticize each other and complement each other and as I say, constantly change what we know and our understanding. And also we always insist that the devil is in detail. We always insist in complexity of the issues and in variety. So this process, let's say, of confessionalization of identities that I just talked about does not take place at the same time everywhere. Okay, so there are exceptions, there are differences, and so on. So therefore, there is no easy or simple policy directions or suggestions or advice that I could come up with. One of them is to learn and study and debate and engage with our history and that is rich and enriching, and not to be prisoner or simple recipient of a passive recipient of what is usually half-truths and myths which are circulating in media or by political forces which often engage in spreading and distributing half-truths, hate, and even, as we are witnessing at the moment, warmongering, and as we know very well from our recent history, that in the Balkans this was similar. So instead of believing everything or participating in this often warmongering propaganda and hate spreading, I would recommend studying one's history and enriching oneself with the richness and complexity of that history.
Speaking of the enrichment, I intentionally left this question for after you have presented your research a bit to our audience. For those of them who would be interested in the topics you yourself have been researching for a while now, could you recommend them a few books or articles, preferably in English, but also in other European languages, depending on where our audience stems from?
Well, I could recommend in relation to my work and these topics that we have discussed, the work of my colleague, German historian Klaus Buchenau, who studied the relations between church and state in Yugoslavia, and the interplay of these forces, and how they tried to reconcile in socialist Yugoslavia, and how eventually that attempted reconciliation failed, and then both the Serbian Orthodox and Croatian or Catholic Church among Croatians became part of the conflict and took sides in the conflict. So this is one aspect of his work that I admire. And another one is the transfer of ideas that Buchenau studied from Russia, or from some circles in Russian Orthodox Church, into Serbian Orthodox Church, which happened in the 19th century through Serbian students in Russian academies, but then more notably in the interwar period. As I said, the crucial interwar period is when thousands of and tens of thousands of Russians escape after the October Revolution, and King Alexander Karađorđević welcomes them in Yugoslavia. King Alexander was very anti-Bolshevik and Russophile, so he embraced, and this part of our history is usually celebrated. The embrace, of course, is to be celebrated, but we need to know that among those who came, it is actually the most conservative part of the Russian emigration that found its home in Belgrade and in Yugoslavia. So the progressive Russians and so on went to Paris and London, but the conservative monarchist and nationalist and so on found their home in Karlovci, and they influenced, for example, the emergence of the ideology of Svetosavlje, which is very difficult to define, but from 1930s it became a synonym for this bond between confessional and ethnic identity. Okay, so this is how this merging took place under the guise of Khrapovitsky and other Titov and so on, Russian ideologues. So this is the work of my colleague Klaus Buchenau, and also my supervisor Thomas Bremer, and but I can recommend many other works on other topics that I admire. For example, here in Britain, Professor Robin O'Kee, who was writing about Bosnian history and Bosnia and the Austrian occupation, and the effect on this on the development of nationalism in Bosnia. So there is plenty of books, and your readers can, if they have particular interest, can write to me, and I will guide them to literature in other fields.
That's great. Thank you very much for sharing that, Professor. Now, bearing in mind that you're in your office at the university, we cannot end this call without asking you a bit about your daily work. How does a life of a historian and college professor looks like? How your daily work is being conducted? Are you mostly in the university, or are you mostly in the libraries? How does your daily life looks like?
Well, it depends on the periods, whether we are in term time or in the breaks between terms or in the summer recess. So in the term time, again, depends on my timetable of teaching, but I teach and I teach history of Yugoslavia, I teach history of the Balkans, I also teach a postgraduate course on links between religion and history and how to study religious phenomena in history. And I have plenty of students who are interested in Balkan history and in these topics. So I have a lot of work in terms of consulting with students, assisting with their dissertations, and preparing and teaching. But that's only one aspect. I teach at a research-based university, so I spend a lot of time actually doing research, which when I am in London term time or when there is no lockdown, then I am reading in across the street British Library and several other libraries and archives here in Bloomsbury and in London in general. And then I also go on research trips to Serbia, to Croatia, to Budapest, to Vienna, to many places which are where one can find and research on Balkan history. And before these limitations of travel and so on, I was also participating in international networks of scholars. This is another field of my studies, the so-called transnational history, the connections. I participated in a big transnational also network of scholars which was researching the connections between resistance movements and anti-fascist resistance themselves across borders. And this is not something that first comes to mind, but there were many connections and both concrete but also ideological between resistance first in Spanish Civil War and then resistance in France and Yugoslavia and Greece and Poland and Russian partisans and so on, and this is has been occupying me also in last few years.
Bearing in mind that your work has also changed a bit during the ongoing Corona crisis, we are now in a new crisis at the time as we speak, so COVID is like a secondary topic. Bearing in mind that the world has changed since you moved to UK and London, where do you see yourself in the next 10 years? How do you think that your job will change? Will it be more in the field, or depending on how the global pandemic situation or global situation in general changes, where do you see yourself in 10 years?
I am very concerned and very pessimistic with what I perceive as an all-out assault on science and knowledge. I was taught, and I teach my student that science should be understood in plural terms, that science is a debate and discussion, and that it's constantly evolving through different opinions and exchange of opinions. And I am afraid that both during the pandemic and the current crisis, the approach of media and domination of the so-called anti-social media is limiting the debate and discussion and imposing a singular vision. And the titles have always been scientists say this, science says this, as if all scientists think the same, or science has only one thing to say and agrees on everything. And this is, as I could witness, this was the case with medical or biological sciences, and this is the case also with social, historical sciences, where I am engaged. So this is my greatest challenge in my work and with my students, is to preserve the openness and free thinking and free debate and freedom of speech and freedom of academic inquiry. And I think that it is under serious threat of, again, I repeat, anti-social media and political and economic developments in the society, domination of certain power lobbies and in industries and so on, which benefit from this lack of free debate and exchange.
Professor, before we close, I need to ask you one last question, and that is, what is the single most important thing that you like about your job? Be it researcher or be it professor.
This is the easiest question so far, and thank you for asking this for the end. My greatest pleasure is to teach and supervise and be in permanent contact and debate with my students, and that keeps me young and that keeps me going. And the curiosity and openness and of my students that come from all over the world continues to impress me and to keep me, if you want, alive in these difficult times. And this is what motivates me to get out of the bed every morning.
Professor, any last words? Anything else you would like to mention before we close?
No, just greetings and thanks to you and to all your listeners, and inviting them to read more and to explore more, and in case they have questions, especially concerning my field, which is Balkan history, they can easily find online my contacts and they can address these questions. Thank you.
We'll put that also in show notes so they can directly contact you. Thank you very much for your time, and thank you for being my guest in the RNT podcast.
Thank you, Gavrilo. Thank you, everybody.